Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Richard III podcast, in which we will look in detail at the coronation of King Richard III and what it can tell us of the beginning of this infamous king's reign. The coronation that took place on Sunday the 6th of July 1483 was, only a fortnight earlier, unplanned. London was prepared for a coronation, that of King Edward V on the 22nd of June, but that was fated not to take place. Edward, as we saw in the last episode, had been declared illegitimate and his protector asked to take the throne. King Richard III's coronation was significant on many levels, but the political and dynastic shockwaves of the following years have overshadowed the magnificent spectacle of a coronation memorable for a catalogue of reasons. A coronation had been made ready, so the pomp and splendid pageantry was in place, streets bursting with colour and packed with bodies hungry for a glimpse of their new monarch. The first matter of note was that this was a joint coronation. King Richard and his wife, Queen Anne Neville, were crowned together. This had only happened 3 times before. Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine had enjoyed a dual coronation on Sunday the 19th of December 1154, though they had perhaps not enjoyed their subsequent relationship quite so much. Edward I was crowned alongside Eleanor of Castile on the 19th of August 1274, and his son Edward II had his wife Isabella of France crowned beside him on the 25th of February 1308. The joint coronation of Richard and Anne was the first in 175 years. The absence for so long of a couple being crowned together was in part a testament to the upheavals of the previous century or more. Edward III had taken his father's throne at a young age. His heir had died less than a year before he was to, leaving his 10-year-old grandson to reign. Richard II was to be punished for his tyranny when the unmarried Henry IV removed him. Henry died aged 46, leaving his unmarried son to be crowned King Henry V. When that warrior king died, his son was only 9 months old. Henry VI's insipid rule brought about the Wars of the Roses and saw Edward IV seize the throne, crowned at 19 before he met Elizabeth Woodville. It was his son, aged 12, who was due to have been crowned on the 22nd of June. So perhaps this joint coronation of a settled, mature couple, Richard being 30 and Anne aged 27, promised much. They had a son and heir too. The omens were promising. This was something new, at a time when the country did not want old problems. On Sunday the 6th of July, King Richard and Queen Anne processed to Westminster Hall, walking on a carpet of vibrant red cloth. The master of the ceremonies that had now begun to unfold was Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, another matter of some significance. John Howard had been granted the offices of Earl Marshal and High Steward of England, making him the man traditionally positioned to oversee the coronation. Buckingham, though, had handed Richard his crown, and he was determined to be the second most significant man in attendance, and it is questionable whether second was ever enough for this proud man. The coronation set a precedent of spoiled indulgence that was soon to overflow into rebellion. The spectacle proper began as the King and Queen processed now from Westminster Hall to Westminster Abbey. They walked barefoot, as was traditional, behind a large cross and members of the clergy. Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, carried the blunt sword of mercy. Thomas, Lord Stanley, bore the Lord High Constable's mace. Next came Edmund Grey, Earl of Kent, who, as Lord Grey of Ruthin, had switched his Lancastrian allegiance to York at the Battle of Northampton in 1460. Alongside the Earl was Richard's closest friend, Francis Viscount Lovell. Each carried a pointed sword of justice. Richard's brother-in-law, John de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, held the sceptre, and Suffolk's son, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, bore the cross and ball. Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, solemnly bore the sheathed sword of state held upright before him. Finally came Surrey's father, John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, carefully holding the crown in his hands. King Richard himself walked enrobed in a sumptuous purple velvet gown, a bishop at each shoulder, and his train borne without humility by the Duke of Buckingham. The Warden of the Cinque Ports held the cloth of estate above the king's head. The luxury and vivid, vibrant colours would have been a sight to behold, and the message of a bright new future clear for all to see. Behind followed a series of earls, barons and lords bearing the Queen's regalia. Anne walked behind, with Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond and mother of Henry Tudor, holding her train. Richard's sister, Elizabeth, Duchess of Suffolk, walked alone in state, followed by a further 20 ladies of the nobility and a glorious host of knights and squires. The sheer scale and majesty of the event must have been enough to inspire awe, creating a wave upon which the new king and queen might ride to glory. As they entered Westminster Abbey, the space erupted with rejoicing choral voices. Divested of their ceremonial garb, the king and queen were anointed with holy oil by Thomas Bourchier, Archbishop of Canterbury. When they had been enrobed in sumptuous cloth of gold, the elderly archbishop lowered a crown upon the heads of the new king and queen. Organ music filled the sacred space. A solemn Te Deum was sung and High Mass was said. England was rejoicing in the King and Queen that God had appointed to her. The spectacle was far from over, though. The coronation feast was eagerly expected next, with its accompanying displays of tradition laden with meaning. In Westminster Hall, the Duke of Norfolk entered riding a charger adorned in cloth of gold to evict the gathered spectators and make room for the feast. A table on the dais was laid for the King and Queen. On the floor of the hall, 4 further tables were placed, one for the attending bishops, the second for the high-ranking nobility, the third for the barons, and the fourth for the ladies that were invited. Each filed in, pledging their loyalty to the King and Queen before taking their seat. In all, over 3,000 people attended the feast. Richard III's coronation was perhaps the last on this scale. Numbers catered for at the feast fell dramatically in subsequent years until it was abandoned altogether in 1830 by William IV on the grounds of cost. No monarch since has reinstated this event. Before the second course of the feast was served, the King's champion burst into the hall. Sir Robert Dimmock, whose family still hold the ceremonial position today, rode a huge destrier draped in red and white silk and wore armour of bright, dazzling, pure white. He issued the traditional challenge to any who doubted King Richard's right to rule, and the room rang to shouts of "King Richard! King Richard!" When no challenge to the new king's title was forthcoming, the champion was served a covered goblet of red wine. Taking a draught, he cast the rest upon the floor, keeping the cup as his reward, and rode from the room, his traditional duty fulfilled and his challenge suitably unanswered. The whole event had been an unmitigated success, perhaps the most lavish, well-attended and best-celebrated coronation Westminster Abbey had ever seen. At least it was in living memory. The Tudors were renowned for their use of spectacle as propaganda, but here King Richard III set a benchmark that even they would struggle to match. Lost amid the rapturous pageantry were several notable anomalies, full of both promise and foreboding. With the exception of 3 earls who were minors too young to attend, and a small handful of others, the entire English nobility turned out to celebrate the coronation. By comparison, the ceremonies both before of Edward IV and after of Henry VII were bland partisan affairs. Richard appeared to have embraced all of his new subjects. The Lancastrian Earl of Northumberland and Lady Margaret Beaufort were in places of honour. Allies of his brother and the House of York did not spurn the new king as so many would only 2 years later. Conciliation and the healing of old wounds must have seemed a very real and very appealing possibility. Without the benefit of hindsight, England must have appeared settled and happy, looking forward to a bright new future. However, examining the makeup of the procession more closely raises an interesting question that adds to the foreboding hinted at by Buckingham's leading role. Thomas Lord Stanley, proudly carrying the constable's mace, walked in a position senior to dukes and earls alike, an odd turn of events for a man known for a lack of loyalty that was unpalatable to Richard. Thomas Stanley had also been wrapped up in the accusations of treason and plotting that had blighted Richard's arrival in London 2 months earlier. As with so many matters, there is far more to this story than at first appears. Stanley had been involved in a long feud over possession of Hornby Castle with Sir James Harrington. Richard had, as early as 1470, taken Harrington's side in the affair, yet chose now to lavishly honour Stanley. Was this a nod to the inescapable political reality that Edward IV had worked within? Stanley headed a voracious up-and-coming family that boasted a huge force of men upon which they could call. This may have been a genuine attempt to build political bridges. If he was to rule England, niggling local feuds would have to be put to bed. Or perhaps Richard realised that he would need men like Stanley on his side if he was to rule successfully. Either way, an old enemy was in a place of high honour. Behind Anne walked another figure of some interest. She happened to be both the wife of Thomas Lord Stanley and the mother of the final fading ember of Lancastrian hope in exile. Margaret Beaufort was a natural Lancastrian, a descendant of John of Gaunt, yet she walked ahead of the Yorkist Duchess. Her son and his uncle had spent the last dozen years in exile. There is evidence that Edward IV had been some way along the path to negotiating Henry Tudor's return as a friend and his marriage to one of Edward's own daughters, perhaps, though most likely not, Elizabeth of York, Henry's future queen. Was Richard intending to continue the attempt to bring the final stray within the fold, or was he simply unable to escape the need to appease powerful enemies, however irreconcilable they may remain? Henry Tudor was the final potential threat to the House of York. Imagine if he were made a friend. Hindsight will tell us that the reign of King Edward III and his Queen Anne was not to last. Those honoured that day contributed to his downfall. Its attendants did not have this knowledge, and for those who stood in Westminster Abbey, for those who sat indulging at the feast, and for those who lined the streets cheering and soaking up the atmosphere, It was a spectacle like no other they had ever seen. It promised security, safety, and a settled contentment for a country nursing ragged scars. Or perhaps the signs were there, just beneath the polished veneer, that this was a veil drawn over old, unresolved problems and new lurking threats, a bandage applied to a ragged scar about to reopen once more. Were there those who already plotted against the cheers of the crowds? Or could none have known the troubles to come as the streets of London joyously rang out to a single call, "Long live King Richard!" Thank you for listening to this episode of the Richard III podcast.